Welcome to Aviation News Talk. Coming up on the show, lots of general aviation news, including an FAA controller sends a pilot with engine trouble to an airfield that was closed 25 years before. Two major aircraft manufacturers are merging, and one of their names is going away. Pilots are getting violated left and right by the FAA in this new hotspot. A company that runs a private tower at a U.S. airport will have to pay $17 million because of a controller error. And from our "You've got to be kidding me" department, a pilot screws up big time and was arrested on Monday. After the news, we'll talk about the mistake I made over the weekend, which I'm still kicking myself about. And in more detail, we'll talk about what pilots can do to avoid deadly distractions. Plus, I'm going to ask you for your help in helping me decide whether to ferry an aircraft from a location that's really a long, long ways away. Plus, listener email and more. And you're never going to believe this. Guess which podcast is listed right now as number one in iTunes under the aviation category? Yep, hard to believe. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Truscott. Today's show is sponsored by... No, I'm just messing with you. My plan is to not accept ads on this show, but I will talk sometimes about my books and online courses, and will occasionally ask you for your direct support. Here's how you can help me today. If you enjoy the show, please tell all of your friends. And special thanks to the 7 people who left iTunes reviews last week. I've picked one of those reviews, which I'll read at the end of the show. All this and more, and the news starts now. This story comes from the Associated Press. A crash that sent a pilot to a closed runway prompts FAA changes. When pilot Joseph Milo reported engine trouble, an air traffic controller directed him to a nearby airfield. But that field had closed 25 years before, and industrial buildings now occupied the former runway. Milo crashed a quarter-mile away and died, and his death prompted the FAA to update its procedures to include weekly accuracy checks of its radar video maps. The erroneous information was one of several factors cited by the NTSB in its investigation of this August 16, 2015 crash. The NTSB said the probable causes were a controller's provision of erroneous emergency divert airport information to the pilot, and Milo's improper decision to delay turning toward a suitable runway once he realized that an engine failure had occurred. Milo, 59, was flying a passenger to Morristown, New Jersey, when a single-engine aircraft hit a railroad crossing in Hicksville, east of New York City. His passenger survived. The pilot told an air traffic controller he was having a little bit of a problem and would have to take it down. He said he would attempt to get to Republic Airport in Farmingdale, which was about 8 nautical miles away at the time. The controller then provided information about a closer runway called the Bethpage Strip, which of course is the site of a former airport associated with defense contractor Northrop Grumman. The controller told the pilot the airport was closed, but that a runway was still there. And it turns out the airfield had been closed in 1990, and industrial buildings now stood on the former runway. The NTSB found that at the time of the crash, the FAA did not require periodic review and validation of its radar video maps, and had no procedures to ensure that non-operational airports were removed from these maps system-wide. Since this accident, the FAA has corrected its internal procedures to ensure that all non-operational airports are removed from radar video maps. FAA spokesman Jim Peters said the new system became operational in November of 2016. He said that all radar video maps are now checked weekly for accuracy. Speaking of crashes, and it's not my plan to talk about most crashes unless there's something significant about the crash. This comes from the Frederick News Post. The families of 2 helicopter pilots who were killed in a 2014 mid-air collision with a small plane have been awarded a total of $17 million in a jury trial. The Midwest Air Traffic Control Services, which is a private air traffic control company, will pay the family of 29-year-old Christopher Parsons $5 million and the family of 47-year-old William Jenkins $12 million per the jury award. The 3 died in October of 2014 in a mid-air crash near the Frederick Municipal Airport in Frederick, Maryland. According to the FAA, a Cirrus SR-22 was en route to the airport, and the Robinson R-44 helicopter was conducting a training exercise when the two aircraft collided. Everyone in the helicopter was killed. The Cirrus pilot pulled the cap's parachute and survived. The controller in the privately owned tower told investigators she had never heard the Cirrus pilot radio in when he was 3 miles away, but transcripts showed that he did contact the tower, and she later realized she must not have heard it. Attorneys for the family argue that she didn't hear it because she was busy clearing a jet on the ground for takeoff. Another controller in the tower offered to help her clear the jet, but she declined. While the duties of controlling traffic on the ground and in the air can be done by different controllers, the controller said that it was not unusual to combine the task. She previously worked only at FAA-controlled towers, which had radar. Frederick Airport does not have radar. Without radar, the controller had no way of knowing at what altitude the aircraft were flying unless the pilots reported it to her. The pilots did not report their altitude. At the time of the crash, she assumed the helicopter pilots wouldn't fly higher than 900 feet without permission because of policies in place at the airport. Fixed-wing aircraft at Frederick are supposed to stay at 1,300 feet. She said, quote, "You can frequently lose sight of them, so the altitude was a stopgap. The helicopter was flying above 900 feet at the time of the crash." An air traffic control expert witness who analyzed the crash determined that the pilot of the helicopter wasn't aware that helicopters were supposed to stay below 900 feet unless authorized to fly higher by the control tower. Well, a very sad accident, but I think the key takeaway is that it really pays to know the traffic pattern altitudes at every airport you fly at before you reach the airport. From Flying Magazine, the FAA adopted a new airworthiness directive last week in response to a report of an event aboard an American Champion Aircraft Corporation plane. Specifically, a pilot reported dealing with a stuck aileron during a flight in his Super Decathlon. And while he was able to unstick the aileron and land successfully, subsequent examination uncovered a cracked structure around several of the aileron hinges, according to the AD. As a result, Decathlon planes, those that have the exposed balance ailerons, now require that a placard be installed, and aerobatic flight will be prohibited for the 10 hours that are allowed prior to an inspection of the aileron hinge rib and support. If no cracks are found during the inspection, the placard can be removed and aerobatic flight continued. The FAA believes that if the condition is not corrected, other pilots may not be as lucky as this one. According to AOPA, there's going to be a change in the weather. Well, at least in the weather forecast. You're probably familiar with what's been called the area forecasts. These are text forecasts that have been around for 50 or 60 years or more. They're also called FAs, and they give you weather for areas outside of airports. Well, in the next few months, they're going to get replaced, and they'll be gone for good by October. In July, flight service specialists will start working with a new tool to help them provide pilot weather briefings using digital static images that provide a snapshot forecast of predominant weather, visibility, wind, and cloud coverage in 3-hour increments out to 18 hours. Now, here's the really odd part of the story. It says a specialist won't have access to the interactive graphical forecast that pilots can view online because of bandwidth constraints. They say the static images are less data dependent, so they will be the alternative that briefers use because apparently there are some bandwidth limitations to the internet access that flight service station providers have. Well, that's kind of odd. Seems like we ought to increase their internet bandwidth. The static images are still under development. Comments on them may be submitted to the National Weather Service through April 30th. And come October, the area forecast will be gone for good here in the U.S. However, area forecasts for Alaska, Hawaii, the Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico will be unaffected, and for these areas, they will continue to use the text-based weather products. Speaking of AOPA, their regional fly-in at Camarillo Airport in Southern California is coming up on April 28th and 29th. Now, they've expanded this from what used to be a one-day show to a two-day show, so events will start on Friday. This article says they're going to have intensive all-day workshops on Friday, that fees apply to that. And they also say that it's a great opportunity to visit nearby attractions, and it's a great airport destination for a weekend trip. Yeah, I agree. This is an absolutely beautiful part of Southern California, located between LA and Santa Barbara, not terribly far from the coast, kind of pastoral area, a lot of fields and open areas, and temperatures are nice. They say it's pretty much 75 degrees Fahrenheit with no humidity almost every day. A lot of shopping nearby. They point out that you're not far from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and also not far from the Channel Islands, which are just off the coast of Southern California. Nearby is also Naval Air Station Point Mugu. And let's see. Yeah, that's most of what they mentioned here. So I would say if you have any opportunity to head out to California, you're going to find 2 days of fun. And I see here on Saturday morning, my favorite activity, a pancake breakfast. So consider heading off to Camarillo for the AOPA Regional Fly-in. From EAA, the Founders Innovation Prize now has a path forward for the next 5 years through the year 2020. This was introduced last year at Aviation Air Venture, and there were 5 finalists. I was able to interview the first prize winner for the Airplane Geeks podcast last year. He's a local fellow here in Silicon Valley who works for Google, came up with a device that he thinks will help reduce loss of control using a technology to present the amount of energy the aircraft has on a display in front of the pilot. Anyway, they have now finished up funding through 2020, 5 years worth of funding for this competition. The top 5 entries each year are going to be invited to a showcase in a shark-style type public presentation at EAA Air Venture in Oshkosh. According to Sean Elliott, the EAA's Vice President of Advocacy and Safety, we're building on the originality, practicality, and imagination shown in the competition's first year in 2016, but we see an even greater possibility as these marvelous safety innovations come our way each year. We want to move the ideas from concept to reality where they can be part of the cockpit of recreational aviators very soon. So the Founders Innovation Prize Grand Prize will be held in 2020, and it's going to be open to any previous finalist or honorable mention entry. To be considered for the Grand Prize, previous entrants are expected to have improved upon their original concept and made an impact in GA safety regarding loss of control accidents. The prize fund for the 2020 Grand Prize will also be increased. Now, you can still enter if you want to be an inventor and you've got a creative idea on how to reduce loss of control accidents in general aviation aircraft. You can still enter up until June 15th. More information available at eaa.org/prize, and we'll have a link in our show notes. Well, at the beginning of the show, I mentioned that pilots were getting violated left and right at a new hotspot, and I bet you guessed that hotspot is Palm Beach, Florida. From the Palm Beach Post comes a story that 5 aircraft violated air restrictions during the president's 4-day Easter weekend stay at the Mar-a-Lago Club in Palm Beach. Now, that brings the total to 45 aircraft that have violated restricted airspace since the president began making his visits to the part-time Palm Beach home. And it goes on to tell you the number of aircraft on each of the different weekends, and it doesn't look like the number is going down. If you haven't been keeping track, let me give you the stats. There have been 13 weekends since the president was inaugurated on Friday, January the 20th, and for 7 of those weekends, or just over half, he's been in Palm Beach. So if you fly in Florida, you probably need to get used to the fact that it looks like on any given weekend, based on history, there's greater than a 50% chance that there's going to be a 30 nautical mile TFR around Palm Beach. And by the way, for those 7 weekends, he's been there for 25 days. So that's about 3.5 days average per visit. So you're going to be having to watch for your TFRs both on Fridays and Mondays. It's not just Saturdays and Sundays. By the way, you might be interested in knowing that typically what happens after you get to have your interview with the Secret Service, you can expect your license to be suspended for 90 days. That's pretty much an automatic process. So it would really pay to be aware of these frequent TFRs that are now becoming a fact of life in Southern Florida. And from our "You've Got to Be Kidding Me" department, this is not a GA story, but sometimes I see a story I just can't pass up. So here we go. A Southwest Airlines pilot was arrested on Monday on a weapons charge in New York after security officials found a loaded handgun in his carry-on bag. Albany County Sheriff Craig Apple said 55-year-old Erik Gibson was slated to pilot a flight to Tampa, Florida on Monday when TSA officers found the gun during routine screening. Apple says that Gibson, who's from Louisiana, told authorities he forgot he was carrying the gun. Now, he had previously flown to Albany from New Orleans on Sunday, but had gone through a crew line that didn't have security screening. So it kind of sounds like he'd gone through, the screening already once before with this gun and hadn't been caught. Apple said Gibson was charged with a misdemeanor weapons possession and released on $200 bail. Officials don't know if he has a lawyer, and Southwest didn't reply to an email seeking comment. And they mentioned it was the second gun found by Albany baggage screeners in 4 weeks, but probably the first one they found from a pilot. All I can say is, yep, I get that sometimes a passenger will forget that they're carrying a handgun, But a pilot? You've got to be kidding me. Now, this next story comes to us from Aviation Safety Network at aviation-safety.net. And there was an unusual event that occurred over the weekend in Texas. A Cessna 208B Super Cargo Master, which is pretty much like the Cessna Caravan, departed from Lubbock International Airport on a domestic cargo flight to Abilene, Texas, on behalf of FedEx Express. About 15 minutes into the flight, the aircraft lost power, began losing altitude. It says it turned to the right, continued to descend where it landed in a field where there were apparently no injuries. Now, what's unusual about this? Well, about 10 years ago, I went to flight safety and trained on the Cessna Caravan simulator and later flew about 70 hours in the Caravan. And the product manager for Cessna Caravans joined us for about a day at the training. What he told us there was that when they examined the engine data for these aircraft, usually these engines go about 1 million hours of operation between engine events. And that when an engine event occurs, that's usually caused by a maintenance problem or pilot error. So these turboprop engines are incredibly reliable and they almost never fail. But unfortunately, one did this weekend, but it looks like the pilot had a good outcome. So we're happy for that. From Flying Magazine, it's the Red Bull races, and the winner is. The Red Bull races were held in San Diego last weekend, and sources placed the crowd, which lined up along the bay at between 20 and 40,000 people. Windy conditions prevailed on Friday for the qualifying races, but nearly perfect weather settled in with light winds and blue skies for the weekend. First place winner was Japanese pilot Yoshi Muroya. He placed first, and this was his second win since joining the Red Bull Air Race World Championships in 2009. His first win was last year in Chiba, Japan, which is the venue for the next race, scheduled to take place June 3rd and 4th. He said, "The next race in Japan is going to be a big one, and it's a big step forward to win here as I head to my home country." Our congratulations to everyone who participated in the Red Bull races. Turning now to international news, this comes from avweb.com. Stemme and Remos to merge. Stemme AG is best known for its high-end motor gliders, the S10 and the S12. They've announced a merger with Remos, the German maker of the GX light sport aircraft, and we just had a story last week about Remos. Now, it turns out Remos has been making structural components for the Stemme motor gliders since 2014. The existing products will continue to be marketed under their current brand names, but Stemme AG will be the name of the combined business going forward. In addition to making consumer motor gliders, Stemme also makes the surveillance aircraft for government and military use. The companies say they have no plans to combine manufacturing facilities, but expect to focus their expansion on Remos's site in Pasewalk, which is located north of Berlin near the North Sea. And more new aircraft introduced at the Friedrichshafen show in Germany last week. I have a photo sent here by listener Ute Stumpf of the e-Volo 2X Volocopter, which they expect to put on sale in 2018. The German company plans to certify the two-seat version 2X, and then later they expect to develop a four-seat model and obtain a certification for commercial operations as an air taxi. The all-electric 2X has a quick-change lithium-ion battery system they claim takes just a few minutes to swap. Maximum flight time with one battery set is said to be 27 minutes at about 31 miles an hour and a maximum range of about 17 miles at a speed of 43 miles an hour. Other key factors for the Volocopter 2X: maximum takeoff weight of 450 kilograms, maximum payload of 160 kilograms, maximum airspeed of 100 kilometers per hour or about 62 miles an hour, rate of climb 3 meters per second, service ceiling of 2,000 meters, which is going to be, about 6,500 feet. They say the 2X can be flown under a German sport pilot license, and it's said to be able to fly easily because of automatic height and position control. It has various safety features, including a full aircraft parachute. Boy, we're seeing lots of these on light aircraft, and multiple redundancy and critical components, including propellers, power source, and controls. It has, now this is pretty interesting, no fewer than 18 electric motors. And to look at this picture, we've got a small kind of cockpit, if you will, that's situated below a very large circular frame, and their propellers pointed upward all the way around the circular frame, which is on top of the Volocopter. So rather interesting sight, and be interesting to see if they are successful in getting this certified for air taxi operation. And also at Friedrichshafen last week, from aeronews.net, this reported the first public showing of the Tecnam P2012 Traveller. Now, if you're not familiar with Tecnam, they are well known for making a variety of light sport models, 2- and 4-place aircraft, including one very small 4-place twin-engine aircraft. And they named their aircraft by the year in which they were introduced. So apparently the 2012 was first launched in, about 5 years ago. Anyway, this is quite a departure from anything they've had before. This is an 11-seat Tecnam P2012 Traveller, and they mentioned that they have orders now from operators in Argentina, South Pacific, and Russia, a total of 6 aircraft. So this is a big step up for Tecnam, and we wish them luck. And from down under, the Australia International Airshow was held last month at the Avalon Airport. This show is held every 2 years, and it's mostly a military-type oriented show. However, the boys from the Plane Crazy Down Under podcast have released a new episode with interviews they did at the Avalon Airport. So if you want to know more about the Avalon show, you can look for episode 130 of the Plane Crazy Down Under podcast. And also there's a video from the Plane Spotter HD on YouTube, which shows a lot of the aircraft doing flybys at the airport, and we'll include that in our show notes. And air traffic control privatization continues to heat up here in the United States. Hardly a week goes by without some news. This article this week from the Associated Press says Trump's aviation plans probably won't fly in the Senate. Well, that might be wishful thinking, but I hope they're right. In it, they say that lawmakers from rural states, Democrats and Republican, almost uniformly want to maintain subsidized air service to small airports, which Trump's blueprint proposes to eliminate. He also wants to transfer air traffic control from the FAA to an outside governing board run by the airlines. Senators from rural states fear the economic consequence of taking that responsibility away from the FAA and letting big commercial airlines disproportionately influence how the system operates. They also think the plan to tax takeoffs and landings to pay for the new system would make it more costly to fly smaller private planes. Powerful members of Congress who control the purse strings, meanwhile, don't want to lose oversight of air traffic control. Privatization was also on the agenda when the Pacific Northwest Business Aviation Association held their 9th annual Safety and Security Day on April the 6th. One of the officials addressing them said it's vital that you contact your elected officials to let them know that any proposal to privatize the nation's ATC system and turn it over to an airline-centric board of directors would ultimately result in reduced access for general aviation and adversely impact smaller communities and airports. Also, the NBAA president and CEO Ed Bolin addressed the group by video. He congratulated them for being one of the first to join the fight against ATC privatization, citing their letter in 2015 to congressional representatives. Bolin urged attendees to continue their efforts to educate elected officials about the serious impact that a privatized ATC system could have on business aviation and the communities it serves. And as we mentioned a week or two ago, FAA reauthorization bill is going to be due in September, so you can expect things to heat up between now and then. And that's the news for this week. Next up, that little screw-up I had over the weekend and how distractions were involved with it. Also, let's talk about ferrying an aircraft from almost halfway around the world, plus listener mail and more coming up next. And a quick thank you to all of my listeners. I really can't believe this. It's probably a fluke, but 2 nights ago I went into iTunes, looked under the aviation category, and wow, this show was listed as the #1 podcast in the aviation category. And #2 was Airplane Geeks, which I also do with my co-host friends. So, hey, thanks for making us #1. Like I said, it may be a fluke. I'm sure the rankings changed, but it was so cool to see that. Let's see, let me mention my online courses, and I'll do that really quickly. There are 3 of them up. You can find them by going to aviationnewstalk.com, clicking in the upper right under online courses. There are courses for the G1000, both VFR and IFR, and my WAS course on how to fly GPS approaches is there as well. The courses are $59 and $79 a piece, depending on the course, or you can get a monthly membership for $29.95 and take all of the courses. You can sign off after a month if you'd like, or you can stick around. There will be more courses coming up. The year-long membership is $2.99, and that includes a half-hour consulting call on anything you'd like to talk about over the phone. Let's see. Let's talk about ferrying an aircraft from Qatar. I had a call a couple of days ago. Gentleman wanted to know if I was interested in flying to the Middle East with him, bringing back a light twin all the way back here to California. And I got to tell you, it left me kind of wondering if that's a smart thing to do. I'm not particularly fond of high temperatures anyway, which is why I enjoy living near the coastline here where it's cool. So that's kind of strike number one on the trip. But, number two is this little thing called the Atlantic Ocean. This aircraft is not equipped with de-ice equipment. And of course, we are coming into the summer months where icing would be a little bit less of a problem. But boy, it sounds like an adventure. There is one thing that might mitigate it. Apparently, it might be possible to have that aircraft brought to a Western European country and then start from there. So anyway, tell me your thoughts. I've never really thought about doing a trip like this before. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on contact, and send me an email. Let me know what you might know about doing these kinds of trips. Okay, let's talk about this weekend. Boy, I'm still kicking myself about this. I was flying with a client who had a hangar, and we parked both of our cars in the hangar while we were flying. When we came back, I came out and I backed my car out of the hangar, and I came within less than 1 inch of backing into the tail of his airplane. I've been really kicking myself because I have always been very careful when backing out of hangars before because I know there's an airplane behind me. This time, though, I got distracted, and you probably won't guess what the distraction was, but as I was backing up, I was looking out the window and smiling at a pretty lady who was standing nearby. Boy, that nearly resulted in some major damage, so I learned my lesson there. I got lucky because I stopped backing up the car so that I could then drive forward and turn my car down the ramp. And it was at that point that I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a very large tail of an airplane that looked quite large. So I got out and saw that, wow, I just by luck stopped less than 1 inch from it. Anyway, a few years ago, I noticed that the root cause of some of my flying goof-ups were me not paying attention because I was distracted. And so I started researching literature on distractions while flying several years ago, but what I discovered, there was not much data available. So for the last several years, I've been collecting what I could find into a Word document, and I've been thinking about writing an article on the subject someday. But this incident over the weekend kind of prompted me to think about it, so I thought I'd share a little bit about what I have learned. In analyzing errors that I have made over the past 40 years when I've been flying, I would say that most of them trace back to one of the following items: either fatigue, distraction, like we just talked about, lack of knowledge about something, performing a skill poorly that I knew how to do, or low glucose. In other words, I've just, was running out of energy because I hadn't eaten something recently. But the vast majority of all of them were actually distractions. The other things, pretty rare. So what is a distraction? According to Wikipedia, it's divided attention of an individual or a group from the chosen object of attention onto the source of distraction. Distraction is caused by the lack of ability to pay attention, lack of interest in the object of attention, or the great intensity, novelty, or attractiveness of something other than the object of attention. Distractions come from both external sources and internal sources. So in my search for information, the biggest question I have had is, if a distraction occurs unconsciously, and I'm guessing it does because you wouldn't purposely shift your attention from a high priority task and you didn't really choose to become distracted. If you do get distracted, how can you consciously recognize that you have been distracted in that moment and then shift your focus back to the original task? In other words, how do you know in the moment that you're being distracted and then go on to do something about it? Well, I still haven't written the article because I think there's more to learn about the subject. So if you're aware of any literature on the subject or have developed methods for identifying how you are distracted and how to avoid that, please contact me and share those ideas. But here's what I've come across in my search to understand how to know when we're being distracted. One of the big things I learned is that fatigue is an issue. In an article from PsychCentral.com, it says Rayburn notices that her clients are more distractible when they aren't sleeping enough, drinking enough water, eating enough nutrients, or exercising. Both she and Tuckman stress the importance of engaging in healthy habits. As Rayburn said, something as simple as drinking more water can make it easier to focus. I think I'll do that right now. Okay, I stopped recording and had a big drink of water. Now, I know that I was tired this weekend and I'm probably not getting enough exercise right now, so those are certainly two factors that may have affected me. In an article from bonanza.org, an article called Flying While Tired says, under increasing sleep deprivation, pilot subjects developed these symptoms progressively as impairment increased. Reduced vigilance, irritability, reduced concentration, reduced awareness of deviations, increased rationalization of errors, increase in no better mistakes, trouble understanding ATC instructions, distracts more easily, fixating on one instrument, seat posture relaxes, shows poor judgment, ignores more and more instruments as attention and vision fixates, eye-hand coordination deteriorates, headings are not well held, spatial awareness decreases, hallucinates, and general lack of awareness that anything is wrong. And I've seen that with pilots sometimes where I can see, wow, something is unfolding, and they just have no clue that something is going on. So pretty clear, fatigue makes it easier to get distracted. Now, a couple years ago, I asked a couple of corporate pilot friends of mine about distractions, and I wrote down what they said. Bob said that you're most likely to get distracted when you're complacent, which is most likely to occur when flying into an airport with which you're really familiar, such as your home airport. By contrast, he said that pilots are totally focused when flying IFR into an unfamiliar airport. And Pat and Debbie told me that they anticipate what kind of distractions could occur. They think about these ahead of time so that they'll recognize them when they occur. And they said to try and think about them generically. In other words, what could happen on any flight, and then specifically what might happen on this particular flight, due to a certain passenger or something else that's different. They said to always be thinking about the next things, that is, what you're going to be doing next. And if you find that you're not doing that next thing you had been anticipating, well, maybe you have become distracted. They also said that any surprise, by definition, may be a distraction. So remember this, if you're surprised by something, realize that it's almost certainly a potential distraction. They said, tell passengers, don't talk when I'm final. Tell them when you raise your hand, you need them to stop talking and you won't have time to tell them why. And if they keep talking, just wave your hands more rapidly. Now, here's another idea, and I don't recall where I found this, but this said, develop a habit pattern for flying the plane. Then be vigilant for any breaks in your habit pattern, as this may be a cue that you've encountered a distraction. Use checklists religiously for critical phases of flight so you don't overlook anything. If you get interrupted while using the checklist, go back several items to make sure that you don't inadvertently skip over an item as you resume the checklist. I also recall an article that I read in the New York Times about glucose and decision-making. Though I don't have it here in front of me, what I recall is that basically they have discovered that making decisions consumes glucose. So if you're making lots of decisions, eventually the brain is going to be somewhat depleted and it's going to be tougher to make those decisions. The study, as I recall, was out of Israel, and it was a group of people that were either reviewing appeals or parole requests or something like that. And what they found was that the group made fewer and fewer decisions prior to the noon hour because they were pretty much running their blood sugar down, and it was getting a little more difficult for them to make decisions. Now, the NASA ASRS, that's the Aviation Safety Reporting System, based here in our fair city of Mountain View, California, wrote an article called Strategies for Reducing Vulnerability to Interruptions and Distractions. And in it, they write, quote, one of us has developed a personal technique for using the mnemonic, interruptions always distract, for a 3-step process. And they go on to write, number 1, identify the interruption when it occurs. 2, immediately after the interruption, ask, what was I doing before I was interrupted? And 3, decide what action to take to get back on track. So an interruption is just one kind of distraction, but really we want to identify any distraction immediately and label it as such. I saw this in action a few years ago when I was teaching a citation pilot who had retrofitted his jet with a G1000. At one point in the flight he said, and I quote, that's a distraction, I'll deal with it on the ground. And I thought, wow, that was really, really excellent technique. So while it may be hard in the moment to know just how you're being distracted, once you realize that you are being distracted, say aloud, that's a distraction, and you can also talk about your plan for dealing with this distraction later. Sterile cockpits. Well, the FAA requires airlines and the practice used by corporate pilots, which is to have a sterile cockpit when the flight is below 10,000 feet. Now, that means essentially that pilots are going to refrain from unnecessary activities such as chit-chat, discussion, things like that during these critical phases of flight. I find the 10,000-foot rule, while that works great for airlines, isn't really effective for general aviation aircraft, which often are never above 10,000 feet. So I suggest that people use either a 10-mile from the airport rule or a 10-minute from the airport rule if you're in a really fast aircraft. Just go ahead and plan to have a sterile cockpit. Tell people to keep the chit-chat down to just essential things as you're departing and as you're arriving at the airport. Also from that NASA ASRS article, they say, number one, recognize that conversation is a powerful distractor. Unless a conversation is extremely urgent, it should be suspended momentarily as the aircraft approaches an altitude or route transition, such as a level off or a turn. And they say in high workload situations, conversation should be kept brief and to the point. And even in low workload situations, crew should suspend discussion frequently to scan the status of the aircraft and their situation. This requires considerable discipline because it goes against the natural flow of conversation, which usually is fluid and continuous. This comes from flyingintoprojectmanagement.com. They say, first, as soon as an interruption occurs, there are two immediate priorities. One, recognize and identify the disruption and realize the disruption for what it is, a disruption. Two, reestablish situational awareness. Don't lose sight of the overall situation. And they say, second, reestablish situational awareness by walking through the following three-step process. Identify what was I doing, ask where was I interrupted, and three, decide what decision or action will I need to take in order to get back on track. The article also talks about prioritizing activities so that you can see where the distraction fits into your priorities. Now, most of us has heard as pilots that we should prioritize our activities in the following order: aviate, navigate, communicate. And I think in high workload environments like flying IFR, pilots need an even further refinement on that principle. So, for example, I have a flying IFR and glass cockpit tips document that I share with people that I'm working with, teaching them IFR. And what I tell them in that document, among other things, is that they should prioritize three things above everything else when they're in the IFR environment. And by the way, I constantly see people get distracted with, oh, it's time to pick up the ATIS, when something far more critical should be going on. And so the three things I tell them to prioritize above everything else when they're flying IFR are level off at altitude. So if you're coming up within a couple hundred feet of a level off, don't start thinking about something else. Just wait, pay attention to the level off. Two, rolling out on headings. So if you're in a turn and you're going to be coming out of that turn in 10, 15, 20 seconds, don't be going off to get the ATIS. Think about coming out of the turn and rolling out on the proper heading. And finally, intercepting final approach courses. I find that a lot of people fly right through the final approach course. They forget that, when that needle centers, I need to be doing something. I need to be turning inbound to fly the course. So those are some of my thoughts on distractions pulled from my notes here. There's even more that we could talk about, but I think this is probably enough for now. If you have thoughts or if you have any good academic studies, anything you can point me to, please go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on contact, and send me any information you have on how pilots should be dealing with deadly distractions in the cockpit. Coming up next, emails and questions from listeners like you. And the first email comes from listener Rob, who writes, I've just finished listening to the Newsmaker show in which you interviewed Rod Rakic of Fly Auto. Nicely done. Right near the end, you ask whether airlines have ever used charter services to funnel their people around. I know for a fact that they did use Part 135 aircraft to ferry around employees because I was part of some of those flights years ago. One particular flight I recall was being awakened about 2 a.m. one snowy morning in Chicago to go grab a citation out of Waukegan to transport a couple of United mechanics and their tools to Cedar Rapids to fix a busted aircraft. We took off from Waukegan about 3:30 a.m., stopped at Chicago O'Hare to pick up the team. I taxied right up to the United maintenance ramp on the northwest side of the airport, shut down, grabbed the mechanics and their tools, and we were taxiing into Cedar Rapids about 5 a.m. or so. We sat there 3 or 4 hours till they got their bird running again before backtracking for home. Sure could have used Fly Auto for that, although I wonder if there's a clause in the pilot contract about what kind of aircraft they can travel on between cities. Keep up the nice work. Thanks for that, Rob. And the next email comes from Derek, who says, really enjoyed today's podcast as well, and Fly Auto sounds awesome. Question for me, an experienced GA and corporate aircraft passenger, I would not be horribly comfortable getting into any old aircraft with a pilot I don't know. What is the relative overall safety record for Part 135 charter aircraft versus general aviation population flying Part 91? Keep up the great podcast, and thanks for sharing your world. Well, I had a relative idea what the accidents rates were, but I went ahead and dug out some documents to give you an answer specifically. So there is on the NTSB website what they call the 2015 Preliminary Aviation Statistics spreadsheet. And in Table 10, they say that in 2005, there were 1,200 GA accidents, of which 229 were fatal, and that fatal accident rate was 1.09 fatal accidents per 100,000. So for every 100,000 hours that GA pilots flew, there was one fatal accident. Now, if you go into Table 9, which is the on-demand operations, which would be Part 135 charter, in the same year, 2015, there were 38 accidents, 7 of which were fatal, killing 27 people. Now, they estimated there was a total of 3.5 million flight hours flown for Part 135, and that calculates out to a fatal accident rate of 0.2 fatal accidents per 100,000 hours. So that tells you that Part 135 is about 5 times safer than Part 91 overall. Now, separately, there were very, very few jets involved. Almost all of those accidents were prop aircraft in Part 135. Also, the charter operations Part 135 fatal accident rate is higher in Alaska. Now, if you want to compare it with the airlines, Part 121, their fatal accident rate is essentially 0. The last U.S. air carrier fatal accident in the U.S. was the Colgan Air crash in Buffalo. That was back in 2009. Since then, the airlines have carried over 5 billion passengers. They've boarded U.S. airlines. They've reached their destination safely. So there is really nothing much safer than airline travel. And finally, Steve writes, thanks for a great new podcast. Really enjoyed the first 2 shows, especially your discussion of the Cessna 182. I knew both about its nose-heavy landing characteristics and its heavy elevator, but despite being a physics professor during the week and a flight instructor here in Syracuse, New York on weekends, it never occurred to me that the two are linked. I also have a suggestion for a future topic on the show. I would like to know more about known icing. He says, here in Syracuse, we're frequently blanketed by AirMet Zulu, and when following up with a more detailed icing forecast, it often turns out to be perfectly flyable weather. He says, when I had a discussion with a local DPE, he summarized it as this. Ice is where you find it. His recommendation was simple. If possible, file for an altitude that keeps you above the clouds, if that turns out to be possible. And as for departing through a cloud layer, he has an amazingly simple suggestion. Call the tower before departure and solicit a PIREP from a departing airliner. If they see ice, it is known icing. Otherwise, it's not. Simple as that. Keep up the great show. And thanks for the idea on the topic of known icing. Boy, I'm certainly not an expert on that, but maybe we will find an expert to bring onto the show here at some point in time. That's it for listener email. Let me talk about iTunes. A few weeks ago, I had 0 reviews. Last week, we got 7 reviews. So a big thank you to everyone who took the time to write those reviews, including Keyshab, J. Roberts 67, Fly Marine 09, Don Sebastian, Zillip, Derek Cooks, and Aggravator. And I love the title of Aggravator's review. He wrote, my new favorite aviation podcast. Thanks a lot. Those were all 5-star reviews. All of you said some really nice things about the show, which is gratifying because it does take a lot of time to create the show, but I do have fun doing it for you. Now I'm going to read just one review because it really gives me an opportunity to talk to you about how I organize these episodes. So let me read this one. Keyshab wrote, great podcast so far. Max of G1000 fame is already a polished speaker and podcast host, so the production quality is quite high for an aviation podcast. His discussion of Cessna 182 landing techniques was illuminating. My fear is that the podcast will veer too far into the G1000 IFR geekery. I'm instrument rated, but still don't want to listen to endless talk of buttonology on my commute. Regardless, this is now in my regular rotation. Don't pod fade. In other words, keep the show going, don't end it. Well, Keyshab, thank you for your kind words. I spent about 4 months months preparing to launch the show because I wanted to try and create a high-quality podcast, and I'm happy that's coming through. I'm also very good with the editing software. Yeah, just kidding. I'm indebted to Max Flight of Airplane Geeks podcast, who really impressed upon me the importance of audio quality, and to Dave Jackson of the schoolofpodcasting.com for everything else. Now, Keyshop, don't worry about me doing a deep dive on G1000 and Cirrus Perspective button pushing on this show. The place where I do that is in my books and my online courses, which I already mentioned. But this is how I try to organize this show. I start each episode with news, and I start first with news stories that should be of interest to all pilots. Then I move on to the international and light sport and experimental aircraft news. Finally, when I do a tip, I try to make sure it's of interest to all pilots, and if I'm going to have any deep dive GPS button pushing, that gets saved for the very end of the show. And notice that there wasn't any of that on this show. I think people tend to think that since my books contain technical information, that's all I write about, and that's just not so. If it has anything to do with general aviation, I'm interested in it, and that's what we'll talk about here. So Keyshop, thanks so much for taking the time to write the review. I know how much trouble it is, and I'll explain it. For anyone else who'd like to leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, here's what you have to do. You click search in the lower right, you type in Aviation News Talk, then you click on the largest Aviation News Talk icon at the bottom left. Then you click on the Reviews tab in the middle, and then click on Write a Review. Now, I don't know about you, but I think programming a GPS is easier than that. So if that's too much trouble, just go ahead and tell your friends about the show. Well, that wraps it up for this week's edition of Aviation News Talk. Thanks for listening. You'll find the show notes at the website, aviationnewstalk.com. Here on the iPhone app, if you're using that, just touch the cover artwork and you'll see the show notes there. Remember, if you have any questions for us that we can answer on the show, just leave a message at 650-967-2500 or send an email from the website. So until next time, fly safely and keep the blue side up.